Hello, and welcome to another episode of Joe and Kat Chats. It's episode 25. This week we're talking about Thanksgiving and racism. How are you, Joe?
Ms. Wells, I am on fire. I'm feeling lovely, feeling magical. I'm feeling electric. How are you?
I'm doing well. And for those who have watched some episodes in the past, they might recognize the mask that I'm wearing.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, I wanted to start the episode with this mask because a very good friend of mine, who I admire and love very much, sent me this beautiful mask. His name is Joe Nice.
Oh my gosh, of course it is. Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, and it says "I can't breathe" for those who just listen and don't watch these. And this is, I hope everyone knows by now. It's a phrase to show solidarity for the Black Lives Matter movement, because there are many Black folks, particularly Black men, who have died at the hands of police while their last breath saying "I can't breathe."
Absolutely, absolutely. And Ms. Wells, not only is the phrase "I can't breathe" a symbol of that struggle, and not just domestically in the United States. We've seen examples of police brutality where people have been killed where they've used the phrase "I can't breathe" in other languages.
Yeah.
For example, in Colombia, a lawyer named Javier Ordóñez, and the phrase that he used in Spanish was "no me hago," which means I am, literal translation means I am drowning, but he's saying can't breathe, I'm suffocating. In France, earlier this year, there was a Frenchman of Northern African descent who was killed by police. He was choked out by police. His name is Cedric Chouviat. And his last words, while he was being choked out by police officers, was "I can't breathe." And for the life of me, I cannot remember the French phrase. So the words "I can't breathe" not only hold solidarity and intersectionality with Cedric Chouviat and Javier Ordóñez, but Eric Garner and Freddie Gray and George Floyd and anybody else who has been who suffered at the hands of police brutality and police genocide.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. And speaking of solidarity in the struggle, I have something to show everybody. Many of you are probably like, "Joe, what is this? Why do you have a rubber duck in your hand? What's going on? Did you borrow this from your daughter?" And technically the answer is yes, I actually borrowed it from my daughter's adopted sister. Right now there are protests taking place in Bangkok, Thailand. There are people marching in the streets to have democracy. There are people marching in the streets in Bangkok, Thailand, and the protesters who have been sprayed with water cannons laced with tear gas. I'm going to say that again. Police in Bangkok, Thailand are spraying protesters with water cannons laced with tear gas. In order to show solidarity, the protesters, 20 or 30,000 strong, have been wearing inflatable rubber ducks as a show of solidarity. Obviously, I'm not going to get on camera and wear an inflatable rubber duck. Also, I don't know where I can begin to find a rubber inflatable duck. What I can do is get a rubber duck and in my own kind of way show solidarity to anybody in Bangkok, Thailand who continues to have the four fights that we consistently have as a theme of this show. The fight for humanity, the fight for freedom, the fight for equality, and the fight for survival. So we stand with our people, our brothers and sisters in Bangkok, Thailand. We stand with our Black people. We stand with our LGBTQ community. And we also are going to stand with our indigenous brothers and sisters because that is the topic of today's conversation. We are talking about Thanksgiving and racism.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't have said that all better myself. And if those who are listening haven't been following these chats for too long, we have done a couple of episodes on global issues where we do talk about this stuff at more length. So please do check those out. Those struggles are something that we need to be paying attention to. It's not just those of us in North America that are experiencing, a worldwide, struggle right now. So But bringing it back to North America, we were talking about Thanksgiving today.
Yes, we are.
So I guess in true form, we should probably start with a little bit of a history, let people know what's up, what it is, and then we can dive in from there.
Absolutely. Fire away.
Yeah. Well, so the traditional mythical story of Thanksgiving began in 1621, where the Pilgrims at Plymouth Plantation in Massachusetts had a dinner that is, I guess, touted as this like beautiful coming together of the indigenous folks and the Pilgrim colonial settlers. And they had this big dinner, and really it was sorry, my dog is just joining us randomly here. But so it was really a way for the indigenous folks to basically help the settlers avoid scurvy and avoid dying, because it was right before winter. And this happened in sort of the east coast of North America. And it was actually the Mi'kmaq people, who we talked about a couple of episodes ago, who introduced them to cranberries, which are really vitamin C rich, which is clearly like an avoidance for scurvy. That's the vitamin you need. So that was kind of the story that everyone knows, but it was pretty mythical. So I mean, the story also just sort of says in the traditional way, the textbook style story, is that it was giving thanks for the end of a drought and a bountiful harvest. What it was actually about was to celebrate the quote unquote successful destruction through burning and murder and killing of an indigenous settlement or an indigenous group of people by the colonizers, basically the white European folks that were settlers here. So, do you have anything to add to that history?
No, because that's basically what I've known, or at least understood, growing up in the United States of America. The United States of America has a history of whitewashing everything.
Yeah. So does Canada.
So does Canada, clearly. And we are not interested in whitewashing anything. So we're going to go ahead, and we're not interested in sanitized discourse. So we're going to go ahead and talk about who some of the people are that we celebrate on Thanksgiving that we really have no business celebrating at all. Most notably Christopher Columbus.
Yeah.
When we talk about domestic terrorists, when we talk about international terrorists, when we talk about terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Nusra Front and ISIL and Al-Shabaab, and when we talk about the Proud Boys and the Ku Klux Klan, and we talk about individual terrorists like a Kyle Rittenhouse who walks around Wisconsin with an AR-15 and shoots people. When we talk about terrorists like King Leopold of Belgium, and we talk about Cecil Rhodes, who had an entire nation named after Rhodesia, which eventually became Zimbabwe. Terrorism, Christopher Columbus may be the worst example of a terrorist. Yeah. He is a son of a wool merchant. He was born in Italy. He was a sailor at an early age. And when he was a sailor at an early age, he survived a boat capsizing and eventually made his way to Portugal. And he got educated. He studied cartography, he studied math, and he studied astronomy. So with all of that knowledge, he decided to become a merchant for Spain. And this is right around the time when Spain and Portugal did a lot of colonizing of the world. And we talked about that in the previous episode, how Spain and Portugal decided to colonize a bunch of people and places. And then England and France got in on all of the colonization. So in those times, a lot of explorers were going west to try to find a western route to Asia. I'm sorry, going east to find a route to Asia. And a lot of countries, most notably Spain, France, and Portugal, were like, I'm sorry, France, England, and Portugal were like, you know what? We're not going to have you pay to go the other way to Asia. So Spain did. Well, while working for the Spanish monarchy, Christopher Columbus was supposed to pay 10% of his proceeds of his profits back to Spain. Actually, let me rephrase that. Columbus received 10% of the profits. The Spanish monarchy received 90% in order to pay for the boats and the people, the manpower. So I have some notes here that I want to read to you, because in his fourth and last voyage to the Americas, Christopher Columbus wrote a letter to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And I'm going to read you a piece of what he says here. Okay? He says, "Gold is excellent. Gold is treasure. And he who possesses it does all he wishes to in this world." Okay? I'm going to read that again just to make sure everybody understands it. Gold really is excellent. Gold is treasure. And he who possesses it does all he wishes to in this world. What does that sound like?
Oh, just the purest form of capitalism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Catherine, we know that as the golden rule, but it's the new version of the golden rule. Essentially, he who has the gold makes the rules.
Yeah.
It's the new golden rule, which is rooted in capitalism. So yes. So Columbus had a debt to pay because he was financed by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. So Columbus went from one Caribbean island to the next, looking for gold, looking for anything he could take value of, spices, gold. And eventually he said, hey, you know what? These darker skinned looking people, we'll just capture them too. So what he did is he captured about 1,200 Taino, and Taino were the indigenous people from an island called Hispaniola. Hispaniola is now two countries, Haiti to the west and the Dominican Republic to the east. And he sent them back to Sevilla, Spain. He said, hey, you see all you indigenous folks? We're going to put you on a boat. See you later. And then he did that in 1495. So when many of those people who died on the voyage were just thrown over the sides of the boats. So, see you later. You're gone. Those who survived that voyage across the Atlantic and made it to Sevilla, Spain, and I've actually been to Sevilla, Spain. It's actually a quite interesting city. They were marched through Sevilla's streets and sold as slaves. Open air slave market. So what Christopher Columbus did when he captured these 1,200 Taino from Hispaniola, the indigenous people of Hispaniola, and sent them back, he broke up families. Kids were taken from their parents, husbands and wives were separated. He broke up families. That's what Christopher Columbus did. Now, eventually, Christopher Columbus captured more Taino and more Carib Indians, which is why that group of islands, the Leeward and Windward Islands, and that big body of water is called the Caribbean Sea. So the Carib Indians. And he forced them, and he sent more of them to Spain, and then he sent more of them to work on mines and in plantations across the Caribbean. And then Columbus went ahead and had a small militia that hunted indigenous people for profit and sport. Christopher Columbus did this. He tortured many of the indigenous people. He raped many of them. He murdered them. He used their murdered bodies and fed them to dogs as food. Christopher Columbus did this. In about a period of 4 years, Christopher Columbus either captured or murdered 100,000 Taino, or 1/3 of the population of indigenous people from the island of Hispaniola. That's what Christopher Columbus did. And then on October 12th in these United States, we have a holiday called Columbus Day, where for years we've gone ahead and said, hey, Christopher Columbus discovered America. Christopher Columbus is the person we should be praising for finding this land that white people say that we discovered, even though there were already indigenous people in North America and in the Caribbean. We just talked about the Taino and the Carib. what I'm going to say next is a bit of editorialization, but I think it needs to be said. And I said this on my Instagram story earlier today, and it needs to be repeated again. Fuck Christopher Columbus.
Yes.
We should not be celebrating him at all, in no way, shape, or form. We should not be celebrating Columbus Day. And Columbus Day is my mother's birthday. October 12th is my mother's birthday. But we're not celebrating Columbus. If your city has a statue of Christopher Columbus in it, tear it down. Vandalize it, tear it down.
Yeah.
Tear it down. It happened in Baltimore. A bunch of people tore down a Christopher Columbus statue and threw it in the Inner Harbor. And I wish I was there because I would have helped pick up the pieces and toss it in the water with them when I was there. If you have a street named after Columbus, Columbus Avenue, Columbus Lane, Columbus Court, Columbus Boulevard, Columbus Alley, change it. You can find somebody else to name your street after. If you have a school named after Christopher Columbus, change it. Again, you can find people that are worthy of having their name on the side of a building. Harriet Tubman is a great example. John Brown is a great example. For you, my Canadian sister, how about Terry Fox?
Yeah.
He's an important guy.
Yeah.
He did some good stuff.
Yeah.
Okay? So how about Tommy Douglas? He's an important guy. He's the reason everybody in Canada has healthcare.
Has healthcare, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so
there are plenty
people. There are plenty of other people.
How about some indigenous folks that have,
I agree,
made a difference in our country? There are many BIPOC folks, which is Black, Indigenous, or people of color, that, have made a huge difference, and we are not celebrating them because our countries are based in racist colonial assumptions and laws and et cetera, et cetera. I totally appreciate that you kind of went over what Columbus did, and what you said is really the foundation of the history of indigenous folks in this part of the world, in North America, in Central America, and I mean all over the world, in South America too, but particularly for this episode, we're talking Thanksgiving, so it's North American centric, but yeah, I mean the real traditional thing around Thanksgiving is really a celebration of genocide, of murder, of just horrendous destruction and horrors by white colonial settlers from Europe, and imposed upon the various indigenous folks and peoples of North America. And I will say, we are sort of talking about indigenous folks as a monolith, just for the ease of sort of the language of talking about these peoples. But please look into where you are settled, where you live, and what indigenous peoples land you live on, because there are so many different groups, and the diversity between groups is incredibly vast, so it's absolutely worth looking into. And that is one way that we'll talk about in a little bit, that you can start to decolonize your existence in North America.
Absolutely. And something that I don't necessarily think we discussed in the colonialism episode, but I think there's some sort of there's an obvious connection between tribal groups in Africa, and how when they were colonized, there was no respect to these new nations being formed with respect to the colonization to where these tribal groups lived in Africa, and the indigenous nations that occupied North America. And then when white people came over and decided to say, hey, you know what, we're going to create the first 13 states. There were indigenous people in many of these 13 states. There were indigenous people that occupied these areas that are now called the 13 states. But because the 13 states created these imaginary boundaries, these imaginary geographic boundaries split up indigenous people whose roots have the same sorts of family trees in them. So you
Yeah.
might have a group of indigenous people from upstate New York, and I'm sorry, not even upstate New York. You might have a group of indigenous people from southern New York and a group of indigenous people from northern Pennsylvania, that before that boundary line was created, they were all one indigenous group.
Yes.
But because you now draw a line, this imaginary geographic boundary between southern New York and northern Pennsylvania, hey, I'm on the Pennsylvania side, you're on the New York side. Yeah, and we used to be part of the same indigenous group, but because you now live in southern New York and I now live in northern Pennsylvania, we're now technically different groups. And that sort of splitting up of families and splitting up of communities and splitting up of indigenous nations, it continues that legacy of white supremacy and genocide that Christopher Columbus propagated all those years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's really interesting because there was also like a lot of sort of the groups, indigenous groups, also like traveled a lot. There were nomadic groups of communities that traveled, and so there's these arbitrary boundaries. They could have rights to the same part of land that the government, for example, is trying to do something with, and so like various groups have rights on that land, and so it becomes complicated when you're imposing this sort of colonial both the boundaries and sort of the law system, because it just creates conflict, because it's not about a geographical boundary. It's about the land being, able to live off of for various groups of indigenous peoples, because that's just what it was like. And that's what they deserve. They deserve to, have that land. And that's a whole other conversation we can have as well with the land rights that are still going on, and the struggles that indigenous folks are encountering with land rights.
Exactly. And something else with regards to land and the 13 original colonies. The 13 original colonies, the geographic boundaries, sure, some of them were arbitrarily drawn, but several of those boundaries were used natural geographic landmarks to separate themselves from one place to another. So for example, in the state I grew up in, Maryland and Virginia are separated by the Potomac River. But as you go further west, especially when you cross the Mississippi River, the state boundaries become more geographically shaped, a lot more right angles, as opposed to back east, really more east of the Mississippi River, especially as you get towards the Atlantic Ocean, where physical geography creates the borders between states as opposed to land surveying. And the person you can thank for creating these geographic boundaries based upon right angles is Benjamin Franklin. Because Benjamin Franklin many years ago created something called the North American Land Use System. And then he created various subdivisions of land use. We're not going to get into all of that because that's kind of a bit off topic. But again, if you notice many of the state boundaries west of the Mississippi, it's a lot of squares, a lot of them, a lot of right angles. Maybe with the exception of the Red River that separates Oklahoma and Texas, it's just a lot of squares, especially Wyoming, Colorado. They're squares. You can see them. So that's something that also needs to be taken into account, because back east, you didn't necessarily use land surveying as much. You just said, okay, hey, you know what? This looks like a good spot here. We'll just call this Virginia, call this Maryland. Or you see this river, this Susquehanna River. Okay, we'll just call this Delaware. We'll call this Pennsylvania.
Yeah, rivers, mountain ranges. Yeah, the topography for sure made a difference.
Exactly.
And yes, subdivision also is still used to this day in the prairies of Canada as well. It's like the Midwest, like central North America it's all used. So yeah, Benjamin Franklin.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Absolutely. And something more about Columbus Day. I'm not sure if you can understand this, but in 1971, Columbus Day was made into a federal holiday. Columbus Day was made into a federal holiday in 1971. And I want to read something here that I found out about Columbus Day, because I didn't know President George Bush said this in October of 2002. He should have issued a presidential proclamation celebrating Columbus's bold expedition and pioneering achievements, directing that the, quote, the flag of the United States be displayed on all public buildings on the appointed day in honor of Christopher Columbus. George Bush in 2002 said that. Now, completely missing from any of this was everything that we talked about earlier, all the violence and the slavery and the persecution and the theft and all of, quite honestly, all of the crimes of humanity that Christopher Columbus did. So again, as I said earlier, if you have a building that has Christopher Columbus's name on it, change the name of the building. If you have a school, if you have a street, quite honestly, if you have a city named after Christopher Columbus, there's a couple I can think of right off the top of my head. Columbus, Ohio, where the Ohio State University is located. There's Columbus, Georgia. Change the name of those cities.
Yeah.
Because you shouldn't be honoring them. You shouldn't be honoring a terrorist. You shouldn't be honoring anybody that commits genocide against indigenous people. That person doesn't deserve to be celebrated. He deserves scorn. He deserves ridicule, and he deserves shame. Yeah. Forever. And forever is not long enough.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree with you. Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for saying all of that.
You're welcome.
And interestingly, so Thanksgiving in Canada is actually in October, and this year it did fall on Columbus Day. And so, I mean, we're releasing this episode in a couple days ahead of the American Thanksgiving, but I just thought it was kind of interesting that, we're talking about Columbus and these things are so tied, and it happened to fall, Thanksgiving happened to fall on Columbus Day this year. And yeah, I mean, it's something that should never be celebrated because it's disgusting. And so online on Columbus Day, I noticed that many of the accounts that I follow on Instagram, for example, they've been calling Columbus Day Indigenous Peoples Day. And I think that's a lot more of an appropriate thing to change it to, because we shouldn't be celebrating Columbus. He was a disgusting human being, and he should not be remembered for what he is remembered for widely. The textbooks should be changed and should tell the truth of what a gross human he is. And we should be learning about Indigenous folks, the various, peoples across North America. We should be celebrating them instead of, the disgusting colonialism around these holidays, because we should still, have a holiday. We all deserve that. And it should be for the right reasons, which includes celebrating Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely. In addition to celebrating Indigenous peoples, we should understand the struggles that Indigenous people have. And I remember saying either these exact words or something along these lines, probably about 15 or 20 episodes ago. I said, intersectionality happens when you see your struggle in someone else's eyes. I'm going to say that again. Intersectionality happens when you see your struggle in someone else's eyes. So what I mean by that is, when we understand what the Mi'kmaq people in the Canadian Maritimes are dealing with, or we understand what the Wet'suwet'en people in British Columbia are dealing with, their struggle is not that far removed from the struggles that Black people have in the United States, or Indigenous people have it in Central and South America, or African people have in Africa, or the Aborigines in Australia have. Struggle is struggle, regardless of who is being disenfranchised. And the disenfranchisers, almost in every situation, have been white people.
Absolutely.
So what we should be paying attention to, in addition to learning about Indigenous people and their culture, is learning about their struggle.
Yes.
But again, the only way we are going to have any sort of unity, and I've said this before, unity comes through community. And the sooner that we are able to have that sort of intersectionality within the struggle, of all Black people, all indigenous people, and all people of color, that's when true progress can be made across the board in all countries where you have darker skinned people suffering at the hands of lighter skinned and or white people.
Yeah, and I mean the suffering that you just mentioned is primarily white people, and that's because we have built a system that is based on European, like Western European, civilization, I guess is the right word for it. Yes. It's based in this Christian, tradition that allows it. They built a system that basically promotes power for those with money, yes, which have traditionally been white people. Correct. From Western Europe. So when we're talking about colonization, we're talking about capitalism. Like these things are so intertwined. Sorry, my dog is whining. Okay. They're so intertwined, and that's for a reason. It was intertwined and implemented, and our laws, everything that we sort of abide by in our society is influenced and created for this one thing, is for the wealth of white people and for the power of white people. Correct. To maintain those two things. And those two things are what drive all of the struggles across the globe that we talk about all the time. Like that's what this show is basically about, is the struggles. And so, yeah, I think that's a really important thing to just sort of remind folks of, is these things are all so interconnected and like you said, intersectional, and that's where it comes from and how we're trying to address, I guess.
Exactly. And one of the previous episodes that we had, and it was one of our most viewed episodes, and it obviously ties into this particular episode because the day after Thanksgiving in the United States is a holiday called Black Friday. Mm. And again, people say Black Friday because, it's terrible. Everybody goes out shopping. And again, it just perpetuates that myth that all bad things are Black, which is a complete misnomer. I mean, look at me.
Yeah, you're wonderful. Exactly.
You already know what it is. But my whole point is, again, with everything that's happening right now in the United States and Canada, and neither of our government is taking care of the people. Mm-hmm. I know Canada has ended the CERB benefit, and everybody right now is receiving EI, employment insurance. And we're now in the United States 111 or 112 days since the expiration of the CARES Act, and no one has received anything. And we're not sure there's any sort of conversation in the government right now about any sort of additional stimulus packages. Right. What we should be doing in the United States, and I've talked about worker strikes and everything else, what we also should be doing, is not supporting Black Friday.
I very much agree with that.
Don't support it. Don't support it. So if you think you want to go ahead and spend money that you probably don't have anyway, just for the sake of consumerism and capitalism, don't do it. Don't support these companies. And if you think you want to go ahead and jump online and spend your money on Amazon or any of these other websites to buy stuff, don't do it. Don't support these companies. Don't support these companies. And you know what else? Don't support companies that don't support indigenous people or Black people or people of color.
Yes, thank you.
Don't do that either. Don't do that either. Okay? Because there's a lot of companies out here that were perfectly good to take Black people and indigenous people and people of color's money. And when it's time to hire one of those people to work at your job, no, sorry, there's a glass ceiling. Or you know what? Nah, you're not a good fit. Don't do it. Don't support these companies. It's time that the working class of the world, especially in our countries, United States and Canada, stand up against corporate interests. Yes. And now more than ever is a perfect time to do that. And I think a great way to start this collective strike across the board, Black, white, working class, indigenous, people of color, Black folk, whomever, wherever, is to not support these companies. So Black Friday, do something different. Go for a walk in the woods, toss the Frisbee around the backyard, kick the ball around with your kids, work on an arts or craft, do a crossword puzzle, read a book, do something else.
Yes.
Don't go shop, don't go to the mall. And on Cyber Monday, no, don't do that. Don't click on Amazon. If you need to be on your computer on Monday for Cyber Monday, what you need to be doing is binge watching Joe and Cat chats for 17 or 18 hours. That's an excellent use of your time. And guess what? It's free. It's free. So do that instead. So don't support these companies that don't support Black people, indigenous people, and people of color. Don't support them, because if they don't respect your culture and your heritage and your history, don't give them your commerce. Don't give them their business. Don't give them your time. Don't give them your money.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that, because we do what we do and we try to come up with solutions to these really vast issues that we talk about. One of the notes I wrote for today's episode was on decolonization. And I think it's really pertinent because we're talking about Thanksgiving, we're talking about, the history of both literal genocide and cultural genocide surrounding indigenous folks in North America, which I can talk about in a minute with the cultural genocide. But first I wanted to define what decolonization is, because it seems like it's a term that's coming up more and more as people learn about indigenous history and all of the things around that. So decolonization is the action or process of a state withdrawing from a former colony, leaving it independent. That's the Oxford Dictionary definition, which I think is a lot more complex than it actually provides, I guess. There are colonial settlers here. The colonial settlers, including myself, like I was born here in Canada, there's not a likelihood that all of us will just leave the state independent and give it back to the indigenous folks. But what we can do is decolonize our minds, our hearts, and the literal systems that we are upholding, including, our systems of law, the systems, that uphold systemic racism, I should say. So we need to change our minds first. And in sort of the vein that we, want to provide solutions, you already mentioned one, like we need to support indigenous small businesses. Take the money that you were going to spend on Black Friday stuff, maybe buy a little bit less stuff because we don't need it. Like, my goodness, capitalistic consumerism is just rampant in our countries. But take that money and spend it on indigenous small businesses. There are many to choose from. You can find them very easily online. Oh, sorry, the dog is whining again. You could also volunteer, donate to Indigenous-led organizations. A couple that I follow myself are NDN Collective, Indigenous Climate Action, 1492 Land Back Lane, and there's tons more. I can tag some in the show notes for this episode. And over and above that, I think that, if you're going to take the day off, maybe learn about indigenous people, learn about the history, learn about the land you actually reside on, learn about the treaties that are involved with that land and the people involved in that treaty. In Canada, you can read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or at least read some articles about it. Read books by Indigenous authors if you don't want to, learn about history. There's a lot of Indigenous authors that do fiction books or poetry books or, whatever you want to come up with. Just maybe focus on that for a while. We've recommended these same things when, the Black Lives Matter stuff happened. We want to read books by Black authors.
I agree.
Because we're not exposed to this stuff in sort of the dominant culture and in school necessarily. A lot of us have to seek this stuff out and look for it and learn on our own.
Correct.
Yeah. And the last thing I have is have a conversation with your friends and family about Indigenous issues at the table when you're sharing, or on Zoom, because a lot of people probably aren't getting together this Thanksgiving.
Correct.
Have those conversations. We're having them right now. And I think it's really important to have, diverse opinions and express yourself. And you can teach maybe some friends and family about what you've been learning from, the history, or, what you learned from reading an Indigenous author, for example.
Exactly. We as a society are only as strong as our weakest link. And if our weakest link is blinded by privilege, then our society is set up to fail.
Yeah.
So what we must be doing is not only educating ourselves, but educating others who need to learn.
Yeah.
That way we can become a stronger community and a stronger society.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One other thing I just thought of, actually, there is a course that is free through Coursera through the University of Alberta in Canada, and anybody can take it. It's actually called Indigenous Canada. Yes. So I have signed up for it, but I haven't started it quite yet. So I do encourage everyone to sign up for it. And I have friends who are taking it right now, and they are saying that it's really interesting. And so I encourage everybody to learn about that. It's about the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada, particularly.
Wonderful. I think that's it for this episode. I mean, I don't think we have anything else. I don't think we have anything else to add about this. Essentially, we've done what we typically do in our typical style and format. We defined some terminology. We gave everybody some history. We put out some solutions out there for the people to go ahead and exercise to the best of their abilities. I think this one's a wrap.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, there's a lot to be spoken about, and a lot of history to learn through, about Thanksgiving, about Indigenous people. So I do encourage everyone to really do your research and look into this stuff, because it's not only important, it's pertinent, because Indigenous peoples are still experiencing cultural genocide. And one of those, I guess, so cultural genocide is sort of the systematic destruction of someone's culture through things like, for example, I guess in this instance with the Indigenous peoples of Canada, it was sort of started in the mid 1880s, I think, where the political rhetoric shifted and they wanted to quote unquote Christianize and civilize the Indigenous peoples, and they did this through things like what are they called? The residential schools. Sorry.
Yes.
And so that's also something that people need to know about. We've talked about it before in our chats. So please do reach out if you have questions or you want to talk about any of this stuff. But yeah, I think that we had a really good conversation today. So I thank you. I thank you, Joe.
You're very welcome. And typically what we like to do is define terminology in each episode, because we want to make sure that that everybody understands the words that we're using and how we communicate with people, because communication is information, and information changes situations. Mm-hmm. So next week's episode, and I vividly remember when I sent you the voicemail about this. You were like, "Oh my God, that's such a great idea, Joe!"
I'm so excited, actually.
Yeah. The next episode of the historic Joe and Kat Chat series is going to be called "The Vocabulary of Politics." Once again, the vocabulary of politics. And so often in discourse and in conversation, people use words, but they don't actually know what they mean. Yeah. Or they use them and they use the words incorrectly. I think a wonderful primer for this episode is to watch the language episode.
Yeah,
watch
absolutely.
The language episode first. That way you understand what a word is, or what a sentence is, or what syntax is, or what lexical ambiguity or syntactical ambiguity is, or many of these linguistics terminologies that we discussed a few episodes ago. And then what we're going to do is we have probably about 50 or 60 words that people use commonly when we're talking about racial justice, the social determinants of health, when we talk about LGBTQIA issues, when we talk about colonialism, racism, politics, etc. So many of the words like culture war and politics and neoliberal and socialism and communism and solidarity and failed state, libertarian ideology. What is the difference between politics, policies, and politicians?
Mm-hmm.
What is hypocrisy? What is a corporatocracy? What is a kleptocracy? What is a conservative? What is a liberal? What is income inequality? What is justice? How do you define what justice is? What is identity politics? What does all of this stuff mean? What is systemic racism? What is fascism? What is a coalition, solidarity, a duopoly? What is ableism, sexism, racism? What is an electorate? We're going to talk about what is civil rights? What are human rights? What does it mean to be an abolitionist? What is freedom? What is humanity? What is equality? What is dignity? What is survival? And we talk about so many of these words without actually knowing what these words actually mean. We're going to pick about 20 or 30 of these words and actually define what they are.
Yeah.
Okay? Because it's important that not only that we use words to communicate, but that we use the words that we use to communicate, that we use them correctly.
Yes.
Because improved discourse reduces ignorance, and racism is ignorance. So if we can reduce the amount of ignorance and we fight racism with knowledge and facts, we can reduce and eliminate stereotypes that perpetuate racism. So we're going to go ahead and define a lot of these terminologies that people use haphazardly or incorrectly. And we're going to put them in sentences. We're going to give examples of them. So that way, when you have a conversation about the social determinants of health, or you have a conversation about the LGBTQ community, you have a conversation about Black Lives Matter, you have a conversation about politics, you actually can be educated and know what these conversations, know what these words mean. Because knowledge is power, and knowledge is important, and being educated is important. And we want to make sure that we provide quality information for everybody involved.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm really excited about it because I do think that sometimes I take advantage of, the language and the terminologies that I use because I have been sort of in school and reading and learning about this stuff for so many years now, as have you. So I'm really excited to just delve into it and really get down to what things really mean and how we use them, and how the way we use them is sometimes manipulated and used in a political way instead of just using the actual term for what it means. So I'm really excited for that.
In fact, if you remember the language episode, I talked about how language could be used politically, where I talked about the Falkland Islands, and then there were those bunch of British islands off the coast of southern Argentina, but the Argentinians called the islands Islas Malvinas. So depending on what language you spoke, that defined what your political stance on the Falkland Islands situation, which I think took place in 1981 or 1982, if I'm not mistaken. So again, part of this episode is to not only define these terminologies, but to figure out if we should even be using some of these terminologies or not, based upon the history of where some of these words might come from.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Let's take a look at episode 1, where we talked about racist phraseology, racist phrases. For example, sold down the river, or some of the phrases that we use on a common, like rule of thumb, that should never be used. If you understand the history of the phrase rule of thumb, which is rooted in patriarchy and
violence
and abusing women, we would never use that phrase rule of thumb, but it's still commonly used. So again, the language of politics, that's going to be the next episode number 26. of the ongoing and historic and now legendary Joe and Cat Chat series?
Heck yes. Yeah, I'm excited for that one. And Joe, we started this episode with my mask, and that's a political thing. It's showing solidarity with the various people around the world that are suffering and struggling through their various but linked and similar struggles. And I know you had a protest sign that you were going to let our audience look at. We've got just under 8 minutes left. So
we've got about 7.5, 8 minutes left. Now, right now, I was at a rally not too far from here. I went to a rally in Raleigh, North Carolina about a weekend. Actually, it was not this past weekend, the weekend before that. And I was interviewed by the North Carolina Fight for 15 organization. They're a social organization that is fighting for a $15 minimum wage in North Carolina. And this was my sign. It says, "To Joe and Kamala Harris, America needs." And again, since neither the Democrats nor the Republicans want to do anything for the American people, and we've talked, and one of the future episodes that we're going to have on the Joe and Cat Chat series is discussing Joe Biden's cabinet.
Yeah.
And there's already a bunch of people in Joe Biden's cabinet that are absolutely terrible people. And we're going to outline all of them. And we're not going to vote or shame anybody, because that's not what we do here at the Joe and Cat Chat series. What we are going to do is educate people to let everybody know that, hey, you know what? Voting for Joe Biden was a really fucking bad idea.
Yeah.
And supporting Kamala Harris is an even worse idea.
Yeah. Yeah, which we've already talked about quite a lot, actually. It's not about shaming, like you say. Like we're just trying to get people to understand, like, the implications that are going to be becoming the reality for folks because of this duo that we just, or you guys just elected.
Exactly. So what America needs, because again, the COVID-19 pandemic has decimated small businesses across the country, across yours and mine. And right now, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans want to do anything to help the American people. So what I want to make sure that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris do for the American people immediately, if not sooner, is some COVID-19 relief.
Yes.
Okay. And this is what we need. All right. And we're going to outline this in about the 3 minutes or so that we have left. Okay. COVID-19 relief, including a universal basic income. We need that. Medicare for all, especially in the middle of a pandemic. Hazard pay for frontline workers. Rent, eviction, and parking moratoriums. Expanded SNAP for the unemployed and underemployed. SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This is basically the food stamps program. So while we're giving people a universal basic income so they can pay their bills, and while we cancel their rent, let's subsidize their food so they don't have to spend their universal basic income on food. Yeah. Now, food is means tested. We talked about that in the refugees episode, how you means test the amount of benefits that people receive. And we talked about that in the healthcare episode based upon the federal level of poverty. That same sort of federal level of poverty calculation is used to calculate SNAP benefits, but the calculation is slightly different. Student loan cancellation. This can be done with the stroke of a big pen on the day after Joe Biden and Kamala Harris get inaugurated. Absolutely. This could be done. $1.9 trillion, wipe it off the board clean. Because if the federal government can give nearly $5 trillion to the richest 1,000% and the biggest banks in the United States, they can find about $2 trillion to cancel everybody's student loan debt.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Nationwide marijuana legalization. If you want to put a dent and a stranglehold and eventually choke out and get rid of the opioid crisis in the United States, legalize marijuana nationwide.
I would go further with that one and say decriminalize all drug use and drug possession, all drugs, not just marijuana or cannabis.
Fair enough. A demilitarized Green New Deal.
Yes, please.
Okay, we need to get a Green New Deal. We need to save the environment. Ecocide is a problem and it's knocking on our doorstep. There it is right there. You just heard it. Okay. And if we demilitarize, that means we take money out of the Pentagon and we put the massive resources of the Defense Department into supplementing this Green New Deal. Because if they can make drones, they can make wind farms. If they can make tanks, they can make high-speed rail. If you can make missiles with an accuracy of a millimeter, you can make cell phone towers that aren't 5G that get you a signal anywhere in the United States, regardless of if you're in a tunnel or 35,000 feet in the air in an airplane.
Yes.
Demilitarize it, okay? Free the prisoners, including deactivating immigrations and customs enforcement, ending bail for jail, and releasing all nonviolent drug offenders. And while you're releasing all these nonviolent drug offenders, give them an opportunity to sell marijuana, because many of these nonviolent drug offenders who got sent to jail, guess who sent a lot of them to jail? Oh my gosh, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
Miss Harris, yeah, exactly.
Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and that's the 2-minute warning. And housing for all. Stop jailing homeless people. Find homes for them to live in. Right now, there are more unoccupied houses and properties in the United States than there are homeless people. There should be no reason that places like Skid Row exist. And in your country, there should be no excuse for why the downtown east side in Vancouver, a place that I know quite well because I lived there for several months, there's no place why Hastings Street and Powell Street and Cordova Street and Oppenheimer Park should exist. You shouldn't have people living in tents. Find housing for everybody. Because if the governments of our countries can find money for war, they for goddamn sure find houses to put people in.
Absolutely. And it's worked before. Providing housing, stimulates, economic growth, which is absolutely something that is suffering right now because of the pandemic. And so, there have been pilot projects. There have been, I think was it Denmark that they implemented that house? It was Finland. Thank you.
It's called Housing First.
Yeah, and they did a program in somewhere in Utah, I think, that also worked gloriously. Because Absolutely. When somebody has a place to live and stability, they are more willing to both get a job, keep a job, and they eventually become, able to pay for all of those things. So it's lovely. And so I think it's a really, really important thing to implement. So yeah, we're just about out of time, Joe.
Yep. All right.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for another amazing episode. I always enjoy these. So,
right, so do I. Look forward to these every week.
Yes, me too. You take care until next week.
All right. Peace.
Bye.
Word.